Welcome back to another video. So I've been seeing so many videos now, so much discussion around the idea that things are spiraling so out of control in the UK that people are starting to voice the actual term civil war. And clearly the government is, I feel the government is doing nothing but fueling a growing discontent and sense of frustration and outrage amongst the British people that eventually something's going to kick off. It's, I don't think that this is an exaggeration. I don't think this is scaremongering. But at some point, you can only push people so far. Today, reports of Graham Linehan, the writer of Father Ted, was arrested by five armed counter-terrorist police at the airport for a series of tweets he had posted earlier this year. I'll put a picture here. And was brought in for questioning, and then had an episode, suffering from high blood pressure. He ended up in hospital. By all accounts, he's doing fine now. But it's just another example of how the police have been absolutely politicized. I mentioned in my video this morning about people being arrested for flying, for waving flags. And there's no shortage of videos online on YouTube showing people being arrested. And you will only push people so far and I think that a lot of the protests and riots that we've been seeing will just be a precursor, a taste of what potentially could come if the government continues being so completely tone deaf and just so intent on quashing the sentiment and the will of the people, that eventually things are going to boil over. Thankfully, they haven't. I don't know if anybody remembers the miners' strikes in the 80s under the Thatcher government. I was fairly young at the time, but I remember watching the news and people were saying that was the closest that the UK has come to civil war. But, I watched a really good video by an ex-para on what would it mean if British troops were deployed in the streets of England or Scotland, Wales. Firstly, the government will have to make a request through the existing MACA, the Military Assistance to the Civil Authorities framework, requesting troops to assist. And this has happened a number of times over recent history, like during COVID, during when there was a shortage of truck drivers to fill the gaps. But I think the last time that armed troops were called in to deal with protesters, to deal with riots, was just after the First World War, during a police strike, and the army was called in to deal with rioters on the streets. But I don't think anybody can remember and again, I'm not going to talk about Northern Ireland, which I think a lot of people can make an argument was a very different situation. I don't think anybody can remember the last time they saw armed British troops on the street, outside of a parade, changing of the guard, that type of thing. But, the government will have to go through very certain steps. But what does this mean for the individual soldier who's called upon to essentially bear arms against their friends, their neighbors? Thankfully, the British Army operates under a very strict set of rules of engagement, and they'll be explicitly outlined. But even with that, even if the government is successful in requesting troops on the ground to deal with protests, to deal with riots, it will just be disastrous for the government to do that. The optics are just absolutely dreadful. Um, and I don't know what the reaction of the individual soldier on the ground would be. I know that I swore allegiance to the Queen, and as did every serviceman and woman then, and to the Queen, to the King today. And that's who their allegiance is to. It's not to the government of the day; it's to the monarch. And ultimately, I think that their real allegiance will be to the people in the communities from which they're from. But unfortunately, the government has administrative responsibility over the armed forces and ultimately will decide what they're doing. And we're talking about a complete breakdown in the civilian authorities here, but it could potentially happen. There's only 146,000 police officers in the UK. How many of them are real frontline officers, can actually go face to face with crowds of rioters and protesters before they're completely overwhelmed, and before the government has to say, okay, or the police authorities have to say, okay, we can't handle this anymore, we need help. But I don't think that it's, God forbid that it ever get to that. But more and more people now are talking about this being a possibility, to the point where now ex-servicemen are discussing rules of engagement, what that looks like. But you continue arresting people like Graham Linehan, and from his tweet, what he was saying basically was just made sense, was common sense up to just a few years ago. Now it's considered illegal, where anti-terrorist police have to bring you in and question you. Thankfully, he's very famous, has a lot of high-profile friends. I mean, J.K. Rowling, Jim Davidson took to the YouTube airwaves and spoke about this. And thankfully, he has a lot of good friends. But what about all the others who don't? What about all of the others who don't have a voice and are still languishing in cells, are still being arrested? I mean, I in an earlier video I mentioned there was, how many thousands, 12,000 arrests a year of people who are posting hurty words, who are posting comments that go against what Starmer and the Labour government want people to think, feel, and believe. You can only push people so far. Eventually, there'll be a crisis point will be reached, and it might not be a very loud crisis point. I remember the Russian Revolution didn't start with armed troops on the ground, or protesting, or rioters, rampaging through the streets. Or it started off with a bunch of women queuing for bread during a time of increasing hunger. Queuing for bread outside of a baker, and the baker saying, "We have no bread left to give you. We have no flour." Eventually, that was the spark. That was the spark of the Russian Revolution. Obviously, a lot had happened before, but there was a spark. And in the UK, it might not be a very bright, powerful, bright spark, but a spark might just ignite the people. I've got no idea what Starmer's doing, but I think this is part of a bigger playbook. We saw glimpses of this during the lockdowns in Canada. We saw how the police responded, or how they acted, or how the authorities acted in Australia. It seems to be something that is spreading across the Western world. Ireland, the government is beyond tone deaf there of what's going on. And now apparently Starmer is looking at rejoining not Interpol, Europol, the European police, and signing onto a framework, an agreement where what was it? Something like 7,000 migrants hit the coast of Italy over the last few days. And Starmer's looking at joining into an agreement with Europol and the European framework that exists around migrants, that could actually end up seeing the UK having to bring in more migrants into the UK, the people won't take it. You know, it's going to go too far, and you know, God forbid that it does. You know, it's I can't imagine what it would look like if, you know, on the streets of Bermondsey, armed troops, armored vehicles driving around. Yeah, it'd be heartbreaking. But let me know your thoughts. Sorry, let me just stop this. Let me know your thoughts. You know, what do you think? Do you think it's a possibility? It's, you know, if anybody's ever served, you know, what do you think you would have done if you were told to go and police your neighborhoods? But let me know what you think. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But listen, guys, I'm trying to get to that 500 subscriber count. So if you haven't already, I would really, really appreciate you subscribing to the channel, hitting like on this video if you did indeed like it. And if you didn't like it, hitting the unlike button twice. That's what someone said to do. I'm just kidding. Yeah, and sharing the video. But yeah, if you could, I'd really appreciate you subscribing. And I'll catch you on the next video.